I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC-Charlotte. We'll be hearing from Nicola Mulder today in just a couple minutes. She's professor and head of computational biology at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She's presenting as part of our series on African access to global research networks. We have Refilwe Masekela's talk from last fall is archived up on the YouTube page, and we are working on another speaker for later this semester. So watch our various advertising spaces for that. I should tell you that the center is also doing a series on bias and AI this year. There's a couple of talks archived on that, again, on the YouTube page. And then we still have Ngozi Okije will be speaking later on that, and Karen Levy of Cornell. So again, we'll advertise those talks fairly soon. The place to find out about center events is the webpage, where you can then sign up. There are links to both Instagram and Facebook. And also we archive all these Zoom talks onto a YouTube channel. And there's a link to that there as well. So again, welcome. And I think I will turn things over to our speaker. So welcome, Nick.
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here at your series. And I'm going to, when necessary, I'm going to try and go through some concepts in a bit more detail in case these are not apparent to everybody, because I'm not aware of everybody's backgrounds. So let's get this show on the road. So I'm going to be talking about challenges in large-scale genomics research in Africa. I'll talk a little bit about why we need African genomics, some of the challenges with African biomedical and health data. And then, as we all know, there's a lot of underrepresentation of African data and also generally in African science on the continent and in the world. And then how we've been addressing some of these challenges through some of the networks that I've been involved in. So we all know that Africa suffers a huge disproportionate burden of diseases. And a lot of these are infectious diseases, so AIDS, TB, and malaria. But we've also seen a big increase in non-communicable diseases on the continent. So your diabetes, your heart disease, diseases that are not related to infections by pathogens. So one of the problems with, one of the intricacies about African genomes is that they are extremely diverse. So your genome is, the DNA that makes up your cells, and just decides on what are your characteristics, and in many cases also what susceptibility to disease you might have. So these variations in people's DNA determines what risk you might increase your risk for particular diseases, what might protect against certain diseases. And African genomes are the most diverse in the world, because this is where life started, is in Africa. And then you have this out of Africa migration to start all the other populations. So they're the oldest populations on Earth. And that means they've had more time to diversify. And so it's impossible to compare work and health related research done in European populations, for example, with African populations, because their DNA and their genetics are so different. And so what this means is that African populations have grown and evolved to have different susceptibilities to diseases. And we've also been exposed to different evolutionary pressures. So our climate is different, diets are different, the abundance of pathogens is different. And so this causes the sort of changes in the genome that allow the African populations to adapt to certain things, but then that might, be actually cause then a risk for other diseases. So we have many cases where, for example, African genomes in the malaria belt have evolved to have some resistance to malaria, but that same change in the DNA actually resulted in sickle cell disease, which is a disease that causes sickling of the red blood cells. And this has led to, this is a very painful disease, and it's prevalent particularly in African populations of African origin. And so we can see that how we've evolved has been shaped by environmental pressures and other things that have changed over time. And it's also important when we're looking at how people are treated. So there's certain drugs, like there's a particular drug called efavirenz for treating HIV. This is used globally, but what people started finding is that people in Southern Africa are having neuropsychiatric side effects to efavirenz. And it turns out it's a mutation in the genome, and it's particularly prevalent in particular populations in Africa. So you can't treat with this drug anymore because of this potential side effect. And as I said, we can't just extrapolate information from European populations. The other thing that we need to consider is that African scientists should be leading their efforts to improve health of their own populations, and we shouldn't have to leave it up to other world populations to do this. So African genomes matter, of course, very much to the African population and our health, but we also have the African genomes also matter globally because, as I said, that Africa is the origin of mankind, and so you have this out-of-Africa migration, which means that every population in the world is derived from the African populations. You also have many people of African descent living in other countries. So this is because of more ancient history of slavery and migration, but even now because of conflicts and various other challenges in African countries, there's a lot of immigration to other countries. So what it means is you have African individuals or people of original African descent living worldwide. So the more we can discover about African genomes, the more it actually impacts the whole world. So the problem with African data is that we're working on something, I've talked about how diverse it is. So this means that the tools and the references that we use are not necessarily appropriate because these have all been designed around European populations because that's what everybody's been studying. But it's important to work on African data, apart from the reasons I've just identified, because the African data can actually put other data into context. So, for example, if you think that somebody's found a change in the DNA, so a variant, it causes susceptibility to a particular, say, heart disease in Europeans, if that variant is actually reasonably common in African populations and they're not getting that disease, then that can tell you, can start to give you an idea about the mechanism of that disease. How is that variant really, really what is causing that disease? And without that extra information, we've heard stories of people terminating pregnancies because they saw somebody with a variation in their fetus's genome. And it turned out if they had enough data from the rest of the world, including African populations, that decision would not have been made. So our African genomes can improve our understanding of human diseases. And so it's important that this data is available and is shared responsibly. So why share genomic or health data? So there are a number of reasons. Obviously, it increases the value of the data. So usually the data is generated by international funders who might have priorities for their taxpayers. So you want to get the most value out of the data. You want to have reproducibility of science, so somebody else should be able to reproduce your results. If other people have access to and can use the health data, it increases the visibility and credibility of those who generated the data. You can get additional science and therefore publications out of it. New research questions can be asked of the data, all big data. Now, a lot of other people come in and see new research questions that can be asked of the data. In genetics, it's particularly important to have big sample sizes because it's a statistical game. So the more we share data, the bigger the overall sample size is, and we can make new discoveries that people can benefit from. So what is required? So the main thing is consent from the participants. They need to consent that their data gets shared once it's been generated. We need a good sharing model, therefore, where you have recognition and acknowledgement of the original source and secure, responsible sharing of the data that's not going to be exploited and used for stigmatization, for example. And then the data itself, obviously, you need good curation of the data. It needs to be clean and usable. And then it needs to be able to be stored somewhere and transferred to wherever it's needed. So the particular barriers to sharing health-related data. So the first thing is obviously clinical data and genetic data. You need to think about the consent. So there's privacy associated with it. There's people are scared that it's going to get into the hands of medical insurance and therefore it's going to count against them. Human genetic data is inherently identifiable. So because your genome tells you who you are, it's unique to you. So you need to have a lot of things in place to make sure that the data around the genome, names, personal information, that is all de-identified, and there's not enough information to re-identify somebody from a complete data set. And then you just don't know who's going to be doing research on your data. And these are vulnerable populations. They've been exploited in the past in terms of sample, and there is the potential for stigmatization depending on the research being done. For pathogen data, there is obviously potential for discovery and commercialization. So, you can find a new drug, a new antimicrobial agent, etc. And so you need to think about benefit sharing. So if you share data, is there a benefit back to the people who generated the data and also the original participants who were recruited to get the samples in the first place? And the issues with data, of course, is that once data is copied, you can't track where it's gone, who's deleting it, who's using it, as opposed to samples, which are finite, they get used up. So data can just be stored and reused indefinitely. So how do you control that? And then the key thing is resources and skills for data sharing. So sharing data, you need to have some curation skills, you need to have some data management skills. And if you look particularly in Africa, as I've said, there's been a historical exploitation of African samples. So it's called helicopter science. People come in, take the samples, go off, and then get all the publications. We need to think about protecting the rights and privacy of participants. Obviously, that's key. But also we found with a lot of the projects we've been working on is that there's inadequate regulatory frameworks for data sharing in Africa. So Nature Africa project I'm going to talk about a bit later, the ethics working group did a study on for several of the countries that are involved in the project. So they looked at 22 different countries, and they looked at the specific national or local guidelines for genomics research. And only 3 countries out of 22 had some guidelines in place. Some of them had, most of the sort of data governance and sovereignty laws had nothing in there about genomics data or biobanking because it was so new to the continent. In some cases, broad consent. So this is where people consent to share their data broadly outside of their own project. It's completely prohibited in some of the countries. In some countries, they don't even mention it. So it's neither prevented nor promoted. And so in some cases, there's allowance for future unspecified research, but with conditions. So there's very much a disparity in what is legislated in different countries in terms of what you can and can't do with genomic data. And so as a result of this, actually, the group got together a whole lot of ethics organizations, committees, national ethics boards from multiple African countries to come together. And this has actually resulted in a change in policy and legislation about genomic data sharing in many countries. So some of the other challenges is inadequate infrastructure for generating data. So just getting the data in the first place. But if you do have it, then the basic IT infrastructure to how do you process, analyze, interpret, curate, transfer, and store data. So in Africa, the infrastructure for data storage and computing is extremely scarce. And for data transfer, because of the internet problems and electricity going down, we actually find it cheaper and quicker to ship hard data on hard drives and courier them around rather than to try to transfer it by the internet. We think about some of the barriers and issues that have come out more recently that have been specific to the COVID pandemic. Previous exploitation of samples. So, previously I was talking about human samples, but during the Ebola outbreaks that happened a few years ago, there was a big outcry about samples that got lost or stolen from Africa, and they just went to other countries, and Africa just sort of lost these samples. So, so there's a lot of resistance now to samples moving off the continent. There have been privacy issues in sharing clinical data. So the pandemic is really important when you're trying to understand how different people are responding to COVID, to have some clinical data associated with that. But that's clinical data that's sitting in the health systems, not in the research space. So it's really difficult access to that data. Many people just take the data, publish, and don't acknowledge or provide any recognition of who generated the data. And then we saw recently when Omicron came out, as soon as it was announced by South African scientists, there was a travel ban and we were not allowed to go anywhere. So that obviously causes barriers to sharing and hesitancy to share. The other thing is that this kind of is in the public health space, and public health institutes tend to have very specific policies about data sharing. Whereas where I've worked previously or mostly is in the academic space. And as a mathematician, data people are generally far more open to sharing, whereas public health, people who work in public health institutes, they're not used to that sort of open sharing of data for research. So it's people have had to get used to this with COVID, and it has worked because COVID, I've never seen sharing like I've seen in the pandemic. So one of the big debates that is being going on is, should you submit to GISA, which is a sort of a more it's an open database of SARS or influenza viral sequences, but they're very specific in who can access the data and acknowledging people. And then the other faction, who are all for open science, is saying, no, you must submit it into the major, completely open public repositories. And not only African scientists around the world are saying, well, actually, GISA is giving us the curation support, provides analysis tools, and it really does help push acknowledgement and promoting collaborations, and it pushes for benefit sharing. And then just some other genomics initiatives. So a new project that's coming out is the Africa Biogenome Project. So there's also a bigger Earth Biogenome Project, which is looking to sequence all species on Earth. So the African one is a component of that, looking at the unique flora and fauna in Africa. And these, of course, have implications for agriculture, health, fisheries, etc. So obviously they address some of the Sustainable Development Goals. But then you need to think about, when you think about sharing of this data, is there potential for commercial applications? And so some of the challenges include the Nagoya Protocol, which is for biodiversity data and is increasingly being applied to all kinds of genomic data. And there's a push for benefit sharing. And so a lot of countries are pushing the Nagoya Protocol and saying, no, if you're sequencing out any genome from our country, we have to have this in place with benefit sharing, and they're restricting access. The regulatory limitations in terms of moving data, but also just shipping the samples somewhere for sequencing. And then those countries don't have data generation capacity, so they need to ship somewhere. So it's quite a lot of challenges associated with setting up this project. So what are the consequences of these barriers? Well, African populations and other parts in any other resources around African sort of genomics and science, they're understudied in genomics. The scale of the studies is small because it's expensive to do research in Africa. The consumables cost more because getting them into the country, and then the duties and everything is just more expensive in Africa to do. And what it means is that as soon as you generate the data outside, or you generate the data and then the data gets analyzed outside of the continent, that ownership or leadership of that project moves off the continent. And so what this has resulted in is complete underrepresentation of African data in public databases. So that is not only data that because it's not being generated, but where it is being generated, people don't want to put it out there. So these are just some examples. I mean, in of various different databases. This is just general omics-related databases, so just high-throughput data, looking at the functions of different genes in the genome. Africa is underrepresented in the EGA. So this is a database of human genome data, human genetic data. I think it's like 0.8% is from Africa. In the GWAS catalog, which is another database of data experiments that have been done on human genomic data, it's about 8%. And yet those 8% have led to more information than some of the data sets that have much higher representation. It shows the value of the data if there was more of it. But this is increasing. So we found in a paper in 2016. So this is, again, a set of, this is human genome data. And this is coming from, in a particular database called Nomad. And the blocks here represent the proportion of the data that is coming from different populations. So East Asian, European, etc. And you can see the tiny little purple bar for African. This has increased. So if you, the same database now in 2021, the African bar has increased, but more than 90% of this is African Americans, not people of African descent living in Africa. But there are a number of studies that are changing this, and one of them, when we're going to talk about it in a bit more detail, you can see that the brown bar, which is the African population, African representation, is increasing in some of the newer studies. And some of the newer studies are focusing particularly on African populations. But there are still gaps. So this just shows you, we looked at what genomics data there is on humans in Africa. And there are a few dots around the continent, but there are big gaps. There's a gap in Central Africa, Central West Africa, and North Africa. And because of the huge diversity, and also the African islands, because of the huge diversity, you just need to step, even within a border, let alone across a border, to get a completely different population group that can provide completely different and novel information. So it's important to have a very widespread geographical distribution. And the other thing we found is that even though the data is sitting in different repositories, it's really hard to find and to find at a granular level. So there's an ontology called Ancestro, which is the human ancestry ontology. And this is for classifying ancestries in particular databases. And when you look at the labels for African, there's African American and Afro-Caribbean, which are off the continent. African unspecified, so maybe people didn't know what country it was. Sub-Saharan African. Now, Sub-Saharan African is, many, many countries. It's not just one country. And then there's Greater Middle Eastern. So in the North Africans are very upset about being classified as Middle Eastern, because in fact they're not. They're African. They are quite distinct from the Middle Eastern populations. And then so that's sort of genomics data itself. So that's just the raw information about your DNA. Then if that's converted to information about, well, what is the implication for medicine and for health? So ClinVar and various other databases, they store information about the link between your changes in your DNA or your variants and particular health risks. And if you look here, the overall sort of blocks represent the whole database, and this tiny little spot at the bottom is how much African data there is in this database. And that comes from only 6 countries in Africa, and these are sort of the richer countries, including South Africa. And then another aspect that's completely underrepresented, so I talked about efavirenz being important because if you have particular changes in your DNA, it's going to cause potential side effects or non-response to certain therapeutics or drugs. And so there's a database called pharmdkb, which captures information about parts of your genome that are relevant to how you should be treated in terms of what drug to use. This database contains only 2.6% of the database has African information in it. So again, completely underrepresented, even though we have huge diversity that is likely to have a huge impact on drug response. So a few studies have identified novel changes in your DNA that are related, and they're very region specific. So whereas most databases would just say pharmdkb, when you search, it just says African. But actually, if you look, North Africa, even one particular country in North Africa is going to have a very different response to somebody in Tanzania, for example. So you really need that level of granularity in terms of describing where the studies have been done. And so it's important to do clinical trials in the relevant regions, because you know that that different people in different regions are going to respond differently to the drugs. But the clinical trials tend to be completely overrepresented in kind of the northern developed countries. So Africa is among the lowest region in terms of clinical trials performed. You can see here again, mostly South Africa, Uganda, and Nigeria. And it's mostly been on the infectious diseases. And so very little clinical trials on any other drugs, which means that many drugs will just not work in African populations. And then finally, the representation in the scientific literature. So before 2004, so many years ago, less than 2% of all research articles were of African origin. And in those, about 60% of them came from South Africa, Nigeria, or Egypt. So it's really the kind of the most populous countries. And even though it's still increased, it's still exceptionally low compared to other world populations. And when you look at authorship, so these are studies that have come out of Africa or on African data or on African populations, less than 50% have an African first or last author. And these are studies that are African, should be African-owned and African-led. The main reason for this is the lack of skills to analyze the data and the confidence to be an equitable partner in a scientific collaboration. So we've been trying to address many of these challenges, and these are two projects that have been trying to do that. So H3Africa and H3Bionet. So H3Africa is a consortium. H3 stands for Human, Hereditary and Health in Africa. And it's funded by the NIH and the Wellcome Trust to look at the genetic and environmental basis for diseases in African populations. And so the projects cover many different countries. It covers many different diseases. It's generating a lot of data in biospecimens. And then what I run is the Pan-African Bioinformatics Network that's helping to manage all this data. So these projects, when they started, the H3Africa projects, they all had to deal with a number of different challenges in setting up genomics projects in resource-limited settings. So there was a lot of community engagement to be done. The communities had not heard of genomics. You have to explain to them, in order to get informed consent, you have to explain to them what is genomics, what does it mean, what are we going to do with the data, etc. And the LC frameworks were not in place, data sharing frameworks were not in place. As you saw previously, the legislation was not in place in how to manage genomic data within sort of national regulations. And there was very little data generation facilities, so sequencing and genotyping. Sequencing facilities, so this is in order to kind of decode the genome. These were not available in most countries, and still only now are being put in for SARS-CoV-2 work, actually. So this is more for the COVID pandemic. And so they've had to establish research infrastructure from scratch with limited infrastructure. So that's electricity, internet, basic laboratory space, grants and contracts management. So getting research projects off the ground in a new institution is extremely difficult. Also, I've mentioned several times the computing and the data infrastructure. This is particularly lacking in terms of being able to store, transfer, analyze, and interpret data. And then, so all of this also comes down to the human capacity. So we just did not have the genomics workforce across all these different sectors when the project started. So H3Africa has addressed many of these challenges. So the community engagement in LC, as you saw the paper, the LC working group has been working on informing and educating ethics boards. As a community engagement working group. They're setting up frameworks and guidance documents. A lot of new facilities have been established, including the technologies, and some of the big companies, Illumina and others, have actually donated big equipment to the continent. There's still a challenge of getting the consumables in at a reasonable cost. In terms of the research infrastructure, so there have been 3 biobanks. So this is where big facilities for storing samples for future use. These have been established. And then we've been through H3Bionet, the Pan-African Bioinformatics Network, we've been establishing the computing infrastructure for the analysis. And then the whole group as a whole, but particularly H3Bionet, we've established a big training program, and we've trained over 4,000 people in Africa. But it's important to ensure that once you train them, they don't just leave and go abroad, that they have the local infrastructure and facilities to do their work effectively. So this is the network that I run. We have nodes across the whole of Africa, and we're trying to build bioinformatics capacity for genomics research in Africa. So we build the skills, we build the computing infrastructure, we build the tools, We support the analysis, and then particularly we support the data sharing, so submission to public repositories and being able to search and find the data for anyone in the world to access. So one of the things we developed across the consortium was a data sharing access and release policy that was a bit more generous than the NIH would normally allow, because it had to take into account the fact that it just takes longer to generate your papers and your analysis. And so we had 9 months for people to come and submit their data, and then there was still a 12-month publication embargo. Normally, the funders have a much tighter time frame for which you have to release your data. And so the policy was built to protect participants while not being a barrier to advancing science, to recognize the contributions of the researchers who generated the data, respecting the consent of the participants, promoting the deposition in public data while respecting the consent, making sure it's available as early as possible, but also ensuring responsible secondary use of the data that is not going to be harmful to the participants. So some of the other documents that have been generated and outputs from the consortium include guidelines for community engagement in Africa, guidelines for informed consent, a framework for African genomics and biobanking, and then we have working groups that have also sort of come together to address these challenges. So, for example, a biobanking working group will come together and work out how to ship samples across Africa when you don't always have dry ice available, for example. So just the challenges that you get associated with low and middle income countries. The key lessons that we've learned is it's important to pool resources and work together. There simply are not enough resources, so we had no choice but to pool resources to get critical mass and achieve large-scale genomics projects. Invest in human capacity. So it's all very well to buy shiny equipment, but and have the samples. But if you don't have the human capacity, you lose that scientific ownership and leadership. And build on what exists. So once this infrastructure was built, and this Africa has been going for 9.5 years now, this has been leveraged and enabled many African countries to respond extremely quickly to the COVID pandemic, because we had the infrastructure, the research infrastructure, the technologies, the data analysis, the people, the trained scientists, and the collaboration between clinicians and scientists. So they're able to respond very quickly to the COVID pandemic in many countries. They're also now working on other things like the Africa Biogenome Project, applying these skills and infrastructure to agricultural projects, etc. And I'm going backwards. And then we've also enabled, the infrastructure has enabled some really high impact research. So we've had cross-consortium projects, and one of them, more recently was published in Nature. This was a big analysis of some of these African genomes that has important implications for health locally and globally. And the key thing about this is it's African-led. So this is the sort of set of people involved. And while there are 3 groups from North America, they're all people of African ancestry. So it was very much an African-led project. So yeah, just to finish off this, there's a lot more work that needs to be done on African genomes. So while we've built the capacity, this needs to continue. Because of the diversity, we need more data than you would need in other populations. If you're working on a single country, for example. So we need to increase the evidence for links between, DNA or genetics and diseases, susceptibility to diseases, to improve our understanding. We need to explore different geographical areas, different regions of the genome. African genomes have pieces in them that are not found in other populations. So we have a lot of novelty to explore still. We need to improve the infrastructure for generating and analyzing data. We want to have a big project to sequence, 3 million genomes, and that's going to require huge infrastructure to get that done and analyzed on the continent. So we need greater capacity for this analysis, that's the bioinformatics side of thing, to ensure we have African leadership and ownership. So to conclude then, African data in science is still severely underrepresented. It has improved, but it's still severely underrepresented. And there's a lot of challenges in availability, accessibility, and sharing of African data, despite the fact that it is so globally important and has enormous potential for novel discoveries and benefits, to health all around the world. we've come, made great strides in building this, but there's still a long way to go. We still need to improve, the embracing of open science. It's very one-sided at the moment. Everybody wants African data, but the Africans are not accessing other people's data. And there are many different reasons for that. And we need to increase equitable access and participation in science. So there are a number of organizations that are realizing we need diversity, and they're really pushing to get Africans to participate, but it has to be on an equal level. And so that there's mutual respect and benefit from those collaborations. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge our consortium, which is pretty big. H3 consortium is about 200 members. H3 Africa consortium is about 500 members. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I don't want to hog the floor, but that's excellent. I see Lisa has her hand up, so I will hand it over to Lisa.
That was actually applause, but I do have a question. I was also going to hold back, but maybe I will go ahead. Thank you, Nicola. That was very interesting. And it's always good to be reminded of how poor a job we're doing as a planet in ensuring equitable access to science. And so I'm wondering if you have a sense of what might be the main reason, if there is one, for the dramatic underrepresentation of data. Is it distrust? So in the United States, for example, we're pretty well aware that, apologies for my dog, that there's significant mistrust of the medical research establishment, and that is the cause of underrepresentation here. But is it also the capability? Is it also the networks that are just beginning to be built and developed? Do you have a sort of top cause for the underrepresentation in mind?
So the top cause, I think, well, number one is funding, and number two is capacity. So up until the H3 Africa initiative, there wasn't big funding coming into the continent because African scientists just simply couldn't compete with the US and other international scientists for the big grants. If you want to do genomics research, you actually need a lot of money because you need big sample sizes, you need to generate the data, the data generation is becoming cheaper, but it's not inconsequential. And then there's all the costs associated with recruiting participants. But I think the next, so funding obviously is fundamental. And if you don't have that funding, you're not going to generate the data. But the next is the capacity to analyze. So even when data had been generated, it probably is sitting under somebody's desk somewhere, in a hard drive, because nobody really knew how to analyze it or interpret it if it didn't go to the northern collaborators. So the capacity for data generation and analysis, I think, are apart from having the money to do that, I think are the key things, and the human capacity to actually carry this out. In many cases, people were just sample collectors. They would collect, and this, the African data is actually available. It's just not under the African umbrella. It's under, other people's umbrellas. And the sharing is also because of the exploitation. So people are not happy to share yet.
Thanks. Eric?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Mulder. That was very nice talk, and I learned a lot from it about the current state of things. The last time I tuned into these debates was about a decade ago, and there was a lot of talk in South Africa and elsewhere about the rubric of genomic sovereignty. Nations claiming a kind of ownership over the genomes of their populations. And I wonder if that caught on in other countries. I know it was a discussion in South Africa, and whether that's part of the barriers that you're talking about is countries, as you said, not being keen on sharing even with each other within Africa, not to mention with the global north.
Yeah, so genomic sovereignty is becoming quite a I wouldn't say an issue, it's becoming quite important now. So South Africa certainly had, we had a whole, they got consultants to get together to work out, what are the needs in terms of genomic sovereignty here. And, but I'm not sure how much of that has moved to national legislation yet. We've now got the PAPIA Act, which is the South African equivalent of GDPR, the European GDPR, this protection of personal information, and that's starting to impose barriers to sharing data. Even though it shouldn't, for genomic data in theory, it shouldn't have a barrier to sharing genomic data for research. But what we're finding actually is that what I'm seeing from my European colleagues is that it's becoming extremely prevalent in Europe, that the European countries are clamping down their borders in terms of data sharing. And so they're starting to implement, barriers to actually, because, you've got the European Open Science Cloud and all these things which are promoting data sharing. And the more they get promoted, the more the governments are going, oh, is this really a good idea? Should we be letting our genomes and our health data and our clinical data and our private data be shared? So South Africa was probably leading the way in Africa in thinking about this. I think other African countries, as I showed in the one paper, some of them had already legislated that you can't share across borders, but that was only a handful. So I think there's probably a difference between the scientists, the health space, and what's actually legislated in government, because the ethics boards, they don't really know who to answer to at the moment, because if it's not written out, spelt out in a law or something, then they don't really know how to act on that. A lot of people are getting around this by and something I was going to put in, but I decided not to, was this federated analysis is saying we could allow you to share data, and if it's in the cloud, if that piece of the cloud is physically located in our country, it's fine. But instead of moving data across borders, you move your tools to the data. So there's now this concept of data visiting. So you never actually move the data across the border. You send your tool, it analyzes the data, and then it just pulls back the results to add to you. And then you send it to the next country and do that. So as more countries clamp down on cross-border movement of data, I think these technologies are going to increase. So yeah, to answer your question, South Africa is pushing that way. Other African countries are going to, but it's also coming out in Europe, and other countries that I've been working with.
And here in the US with Native American groups as well.
Yep.
In fact, I was wondering whether it's trickled down from national levels to particular ethnic groups or populations within the countries making the same sorts of claims to data sovereignty.
Yeah, so the indigenous populations, there's a lot of that happening. So I believe the Native Americans in the US, in Canada, the Aboriginal group in Australia, and then particularly the San population in Southern Africa. So these groups, these cultures have actually organized. So we have the San Council, for example, and they've now taken ownership of anything SAN related. And so they control more than anybody else, more than the government. They get to control who gets access to the data, who even gets access to the participants. The same in the Aboriginal populations. They've also got their own governance structure now just for that group that is different to the rest of the Australian population. So these groups that are the indigenous populations that have been previously exploited or have sensitivities, they are self-governing now in terms of data access and sharing.
So I wonder if I might, this is intended as sort of a follow-up to that. I know that there's been interest by agricultural biotech firms, at least in parts of Africa. And I'm wondering about the intersection between the data regulatory infrastructures for human genomics and those for agricultural genomics. So, for example, again, I'm dating myself, but in sort of 2005 to 10 or roughly, there was this banana wilt problem in Uganda. And part of why you couldn't genetically engineer your way out of that was that the country had no regulatory infrastructure in place to do genetic research or with bananas. And then apparently the US had been pushing for very strange bilateral sort of patent agreements, something that got introduced by the US and the Kenyan parliament at that time. So I wonder if part of what you're seeing is bad memories of expansive patent policies or worries about, what Monsanto and the other big Western agricultural companies are doing.
Yeah, I mean, in humans, there's always fear of, fiddling with your genetics, and with gene editing capabilities now, there's a lot of scope for unethical research. And, the gene editing is doing a lot in terms of curing diseases, and there's a lot of good that can come out of it. But I think there's always a threat that somebody's going to exploit it and, do it the wrong way. For the difference between human and agriculture, I mean, human health, people fundamentally care more about themselves and their own health than they do about the rest of the planet in general. But you can't do experiments on human. You can do experiments on plants. If you want to do anything with human, you need consent from the individual, but you're not going to get consent from a fish or your plant. So in terms of getting access to the materials and using them, and having potentially the freedom to share, is actually more open for non-human, because it's anything that you didn't need consent for. So the regulation comes in well, there's the sovereignty, is there potential for commercialization? And so human has the same regulatory issues, but they also have the added thing of protecting the privacy and the consent of the original sample providers. So there's an extra layer of complexity there. With GM foods and that, I think that's more an understanding of science, the public understanding of what is a GM crop, what is it, and who's benefiting. While human is very, well protected in terms of all the privacy laws and that, the rest of the genomes, like your agriculture, fisheries, all of those, they more. I mean, there isn't much to protect them except for potentially biodiversity laws. And obviously IP laws in different countries, but also the Nagoya Protocol. And the Nagoya Protocol suddenly coming to the fore now, where people are looking and saying, well, actually, if I do sequence everything on Earth, if I sequence something that's only found in a particular country, who owns that data? You're supposed to share the data, but then, if somebody uses that to, say, generate a GM product, who benefits from that? Is the company getting all the money? Will that country from which that original organism derived, will they get any benefit back to them? Will they get licensing fees at a much lower cost? So I think that these regulatory issues across all organisms, no matter what they are, but there's additional complexities depending on whether it is a potential commercial interest. If it's a food source, there are going to be different issues associated with it, as if it's, compared to, say, maybe a butterfly that you just wanted to sequence because you're interested in it. So I think the commercial and health and other SDG-like benefits of the data are going to determine, how sensitive people are to having that data generated or shared or fiddled with.
I'm happy to let other questions come forward, but I have others. I'm wondering about the communication with the communities of participants that are involved in H3 Africa and the data sharing. You mentioned community engagement as a challenge, but what sort of activities go on under that label? And do you feed? Is there a two-way flow of information?
Yeah, so that's also some of the sort of put together around that include the feedback of findings. So there's a lot of engagement that happens, before the project starts, to say, are you interested in doing this research? Describing what the research is about, what genomics is about. And that's being done in different ways. Some people do plays, some people do have cartoons. There's one group that's created a whole cartoon book to describe DNA and what you can do with the DNA. And so they also then have to do it in a certain hierarchical way. So depending on the country, because of the cultures. So in some cultures, you don't speak to the participants directly. You have to go to their community leader or their chief of their village. So you also have to go through the right structures. So it really it depends very much on people who understand and have worked with those communities before and understand those structures, because you can't, if you went to straight up participant, you're disrespecting the chief or you're disrespecting the community. So a lot of engagement is done through going out into the field, working with the community leaders. They then bring the people in, and you sit and have these discussions. So that process actually takes a long time. Yeah. And then there are surveys that are done to say, do you want your the findings fed back? And some projects, in their consent, they say you will not get any information back unless we see that it is something that we can do something about. But there's a debate about this feedback of findings, because what might be actionable in other populations, we don't know yet if it's actionable in our populations. And if it is actionable, do they even have access to that? Right. That treatment, to any further action on that? Because yes, it might impact them if they, had a particular treatment, but if that treatment is just not available in that country, or it's far too expensive, then is it irresponsible to even, tell them that was an option? So there's a big debate around feedback of findings. So what most of them have done is they'll come back and give summary information. So they'll say, overall, we found this, this, and this. And if there is individual things that they can have an impact on their medical health now, then they will, do that with individuals. But they're not allowed to report back about individuals, because it then causes stigma within that community of those individuals. So they have to be broad enough in how they report it, such that people can't say, I know who that was, and they can point to somebody, because that does lead to, a stigma within that community. So there's the engagement, there is two-way engagement, but you have to be very sensitive about the level of engagement, the level of detail provided, and what are you ethically responsible to report back, in the case of, can you even actually do anything about it?
So all the complexities of the questions of returning results that we talk about, plus lots of other complicating factors. Really interesting. Thank you.
Just having, if you say that the proportion of the group was HIV positive, that already, immediately is going to, cause stigma. And, there are cases where, somebody's child is ill, and it's, their genetics, and they'll start to say, oh, it was a curse put on by the gods, from the father, because the father did this. And in some cases, it turns out that the father isn't in fact the father. And so, there are a lot of cases where you have to be very careful about, how things are reported.
So this is a complete change of topic, but what was it, a week or two ago, they announced that some South African scientists had basically reverse engineered the Moderna vaccine. And there's apparently at least some global funding for an effort to build messenger RNA, capacity in South Africa. Is that as big a deal as it is being reported as here? Because it's going to take long enough that this is not a, address COVID tomorrow. This is a build research capacity for the future kind of project.
Yeah, so it's hit the news here as well. So it is, I think it's going to build enormous capacity for, as you say, for future projects. So some people were not happy with the way it was done, I think, and some of the copying of things. But I think it's important that, and it's kind of South Africa's leading the way in ensuring that, I've always talked about, I've talked quite a bit here about taking African ownership, so that Africa doesn't always sit back and wait for somebody else to develop these things, because they're going to be diseases, they're going to be variants, they're going to be all sorts of pathogens that are unique to us, that the rest of the world is not going to need, vaccines or treatments for. So we need to start building the capacity to be the first for once, to have our own solutions to our own problems. And in this case, it's a global problem, but you would have seen the debates about access to vaccines. When the vaccines were first created, they were everyone was accused of hoarding vaccines. And so we had so few doses for our countries, and particularly in the rest of Africa. Luckily, South Africa had done some negotiation to get enough doses. So we'll always be second or third or fourth to everybody else in the world where these things are developed. So if we take ownership and we develop these ourselves, I think, in terms of cost, in terms of job creation, in terms of critical mass and skills, and, just finding our own solutions to our own problems, I think is going to be extremely impactful.
So how helpful then has the World Health Organization been in all of this? Because we tend to get reports on anything outside of the US and Europe via the World Health Organization, but the news often doesn't detail how helpful they are on the ground in other places.
So I don't think they've made a huge difference here. So the South African scientists have taken, pretty clear control here because they had the capacity to do that. And so they work very closely with the WHO. So they've been, they are part of the WHO naming convention for new variants and, how to identify, how to name these variants as they come out and decide whether there are variants of concern. So actually, there's been a lot of input to the WHO from South Africa compared to, how much information we're getting from them and regulation. So the government has actually listened, I think, more to the South African scientists than they have listened to the WHO. They'll refer back to the WHO guidelines, where needed. We've actually worked more closely in terms of the African response with the Africa CDC. So the Africa CDC was actually established fairly recently and has really come to the fore because a lot of the funding for the African response has gone to the CDC, not via the WHO. So CDC is teamed up quite closely with the WHO, but their individual institutes like South Africa's, there's some institutes in South Africa which are part of the Africa CDC kind of network of SARS labs, or actually General Pathogen Genomics Initiative labs. They have been far more responsive and received a lot more funding directly from other organizations than working directly with the WHO. So I think they've been more impactful and helpful to us. And the WHO obviously is the global organization, but they don't always know what's happening on the ground everywhere. And so I think the local context has been more important in terms of the response in South Africa in particular for our government.
So I did want to have one final question. I promise I'll shut up. So if I'm hearing you right, the funding sources are still largely Wellcome, NIH. I suppose the Gates Foundation is big. To what extent is there capacity for funding emerging within Africa? Because that, of course, would be the ultimate way to have autonomy, is to just pay for it yourself, right?
Yes, so that's a big problem. So we've been, we spend a lot of time talking about sustainability of all our activities in our networks. And so we've been kind of lobbying to our governments. And the biggest challenge, I think, for us, I would say South Africa particularly, but this is sort of echoed around Africa, is that the governments have so many other problems to deal with. So research funding is lowest on the agenda. There was a commitment to a certain percentage of their GDP going to research funding. And I think Botswana is the only country that ever reached that, minimum percentage. And it's because we have so many other problems. We've got, housing problems, we've got electricity problems, we've got poverty, we've got all sorts of other things. So the last thing they want to do is put a whole lot of money into research because they don't see the long-term benefits. Governments, people, the ministers of health and science, they are in there for the short term because their terms are so short. So they can't commit to something that they're not going to see the benefit of because they won't be in office anymore. So getting funding from the African governments is extremely challenging, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. In South Africa, the National Research Foundation, which is our main funding agency for research, they have such a small pot of money that they try to spread it quite thinly, quite widely, which means it's spread extremely thin, which means you can't do a genomics research project on that. It's simply not enough money. So we actually have to rely on the Gates, NIH, Wellcome Trust, all the big funders. We're starting to look at some of the expats or the philanthropy organizations. So Patrick, I can't remember his name, is an ex-South African that's just put in millions to build a vaccine facility in Cape Town and to push the COVID effort. And so it's basically a South African, ex-South African who made a lot of money, and somebody managed to convince him that this is a good idea. So the governments know it's just not going to happen for a long time. National funding agencies, they don't have enough money. So the only option is African expats or philanthropists in terms of African money at the moment, unless we get the African Union or the African Development Bank to invest. And the African Development Bank, the World Bank, actually has invested in big African centers of excellence, which requires buy-in from the African governments. But again, that's quite targeted and not for general research.
Okay. Anybody else? I think we're sort of pushing time and folks are starting to dribble out. So if there aren't any further questions, join me in thanking Nicola for the talk today. I definitely learned a lot, and we hope to see everybody here again next time. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for coming.